Hello and welcome to the Ideas Factory. I'm Naghma. Joining me is Professor Pant on this discussion. On this episode, we will begin by looking at the situation in Afghanistan because, as we all now remember, it's good to remind ourselves that it's been 2 years since the Taliban took over. And what is the situation in the country now? Harsh, there are news coming out of Afghanistan which is clearly not a good message for the world. Of course, the atrocities on women, the various restrictions that they've gone back to. The Taliban have also banned all political parties, saying that there is no role of any political party in the Sharia. So it's gone back, or probably worse than what it was after all these years of American intervention in trying to bring Afghanistan on the path of democracy or equal rights for women. It's a bad situation there now.
Indeed, I think the Taliban seems to be making full use of the inattention that the world is, having towards them. And I think the lack of attention, perhaps, is also solidifying Taliban's rule. It has given Taliban enough space to, uh, consolidate their rule over the last 2 years. And increasingly, we also see Taliban making very, claims about how effective they have been in controlling internal unrest, how effective they have been in managing poppy cultivation, in controlling poppy cultivation. So they are trying to put a positive, narrative out of about their rule. But we know, as you were pointing out, that the challenges, especially for minorities, for women, that have been quite glaring and in some ways, heart wrenching. But I think the bigger problem seems to me to be that no one is really interested at the moment. That no one has the time to really deal with what is happening within Afghanistan, given how many other problems are there in the world at the moment, and it almost seems as if countries are relieved that they don't have to deal with the Taliban. But of course, Taliban have been also gingerly making moves for international recognition. They have been continuing their talks with countries like Russia and China, and making a case that, look, we are not as diplomatically isolated as some may believe. Although Russians and the Chinese have also not recognized them as of yet, they have not given them anything concrete. And I think one of the most interesting aspects of Taliban rule for last 2 years has been the kind of problems it has generated for Pakistan. So, in a sense, it has not gone as per the script. It has not gone as per, for everyone. For people who thought the Taliban can be changed, the Taliban 2.0 would be different. For Pakistan, who thought that they can manage, they were very happy when the Taliban were back in power. For a number of regional countries that saw this as an opportunity to push West out and to consolidate their own engagements in the region. So I think for every stakeholder in this conversation, it has not been an upward or a straight line trajectory, and therefore the challenges that that Afghanistan is facing at the moment, huge as they are not generating the kind of widespread support, the widespread backlash that perhaps at one point they would have generated. So when even when you hear about how what they've done to women's rights, how marginalized they've made women, there is hardly any murmur that you hear. Of course, some groups here and there speak up, but I think because the world is today so preoccupied with so many challenges, I think Taliban have made full use of this vacuum, and they have tried to portray themselves as a consolidated unit that is managing Taliban perhaps much better than what was being done under the Western realm and under the Western rule. And that seems to me to be a problem because there are so many challenges out there. Unless we interrogate Taliban, unless we engage with Taliban in some ways and push back against some of these things that the Taliban are doing in Afghanistan, it would be very difficult eventually when these problems really become so huge to handle. It will be very difficult for the international community to manage them in a way that perhaps suits not only the regional security architecture, but also individuals in Afghanistan who have had a better run in the past than they are having at the moment. because the economy is not doing very well, the human rights situation is poor, and of course, for all the claims of Taliban being a single unit, it's very clear that the governance is not really their priority. So all in all, a very sad situation at the moment, but sadder is still that no one is really bothered about it.
There is no pushback. Nobody's bothered. Like you said, the world is too preoccupied with their own problem. America is preoccupied with its own political turmoil. China is also struggling with its crippling economy. There have been news coming in from China, Harsh, which is worrying. But what is China doing, or rather not doing, to kind of get out of the situation is also interesting to see. This soaring level of youth unemployment. Probably in June, it was a record high of 21.3%. This is world's second largest economy, and it is heading towards a slowdown. So probably China has never been able to come out of that very stringent lockdown measures that we saw during the COVID lockdown. How is it going to affect the region? And if China's economy slows down? Also, we are hearing that their solution right now is not publishing the data, for example, the youth unemployment data, and they try to kind of look away from this situation, but it's a difficult situation there too.
I think it's getting very, very difficult. I think more difficult than many had anticipated, because if you would recall, once the COVID restrictions were lifted, in the first quarter after that, Chinese economy did very well, and so the expectation was that the Chinese economy is bouncing back. But today, I think when you look at the numbers, when you look at the data, when you look at the reports coming out of China, it's very clear that I think China still remains constrained by the long COVID. That this is a problem that they have not been able to manage effectively, and that the challenges are mounting on multiple fronts. And the recourse that they have taken to it is, for example, as you were mentioning, not to publish the records, which is not really the solution. But I think the sense that you are getting from the way it is being handled is once again, in some ways, China is being governed very badly, and I think that's a very interesting message you are getting, because the whole claim to fame of the Chinese Communist Party has always been that they are effective. They are very effective in governance. While they may not give political freedoms, political rights, but when it comes to governance, when it comes to economic management, they know what they are doing. They have been much better at it compared to, say, other communist parties, compared to Russia. They have learned their lessons. And I think what has happened in China during COVID and post-COVID, and what is happening right now, underscores that Chinese Communist Party, and particularly Xi Jinping's style of governance, is not really delivering the output for China, or the desired outcomes for China. And that is a challenge for China, given that it is such a large part of the global economy. But it is a challenge for the rest of the world as well, because we are not sure, the rest of the world is not sure, how do you manage this transition from an economy that used to be at the center of global economy, global economic order, to one that is unable to manage even the basics. That here are these challenges that are humongous, and the best thing that they could come up with is to not release the data, for example, on youth unemployment. But if you look at it across the board, there are challenges, whether it is the rising unemployment, whether it is rising growth rate, declining growth rates, declining exports, increasing prices at home, falling prices at home, which is leading to deflation, deflation in China. So there is a widespread pessimism within China, and among Chinese consumers, among Chinese investors, and there is that pessimism is now seeping into global investors. So certainly this is a very vicious cycle that will perhaps exacerbate the problem in China, and this is going to have an effect on the larger global economy, because the global economy is still sputtering, and it's still trying to come to terms with the post-COVID environment. So I think we are in for tough times, both as far as China is concerned and as far as the global economy is concerned.
Well, at this time, we will also be looking at the Brics summit, which is going to take place soon, and Prime Minister Modi is going to visit South Africa, Johannesburg, for the Brics summit. What can be expected out of Brics this time? Also, Xi Jinping is going to be there. He's going to be present, and probably there'll be a meeting we cannot rule out a meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping. What expectations from the Brics summit? Of course, after that, the Prime Minister is going to visit Greece as well, which itself is very remarkable, considering this is probably in 40 years that an Indian Prime Minister is going there. So we look at the Greece-India relationship too, and what is India going to gain out of this increased interaction. But what expectations from the BRICS summit, Harsh?
Well, I think the expectations are not very high, given that it is a difficult summit. Mr. Putin is not coming. He will be there in the virtual format. And, as we were discussing, the whole idea of BRICS was premised on, at one point in time when it was conceived, that these are five emerging economies. Today, I think that there is a big question mark as to which of these five are actually emerging. Only China and India can be counted as emerging powers, economic powers in that sense. The others are not really doing very well economically. And of course, Russia is in a very bad state, but even Brazil and South Africa are struggling. So there is a broader question about the larger cohesiveness of BRICS as to what it represents. It used to be at one point in time, it used to represent this desire among emerging economies for greater voice in global economic governance. But I think today the questions are different. There are concerns, I think, in particular in India and Brazil, and to a certain extent maybe in South Africa as well, that for Russia and China, the whole debate on expansion of BRICS is a debate basically about making BRICS an anti-Western platform, an anti-West platform. And I think that is something where New Delhi, Brasilia, or would be very uncomfortable with. That is not something that they would really like BRICS to become. So I think what would be interesting to see is what is the nature of that conversation on expansion this time. Last time, in principle, it was agreed upon, but this time as we are looking at this expansion issue, we are looking at multiple voices, different voices. India, for example, articulating a need for clearly defined principles, clearly defined parameters on which we can talk of expansion, on which BRICS can talk about expansion. But Chinese are very, there is a long list of countries that want to join BRICS. And I think that question will have to be resolved somehow. There are questions around the BRICS currency. I don't think it will go very far, given the challenges that the world economy is facing, and given the challenges in the process of moving forward in that direction. But I think those questions have been out there in the open. But what would be interesting is what kind of a statement comes out at a time when Russians and the Chinese are, very, very aggressively anti-West, and the West and Russia and West and China fault line is getting sharper by the day. For India, it's going to be a delicate balancing exercise. But I think BRICS as a brand, if it wants to retain or revive its sheen, it will have to do much more than just issue some bland joint statement. And the challenge is, how can you foster greater trust among these five countries? At the moment, in particular between India and China, the trust is very low. So what these five countries can do as a unit, that's going to be a big question going forward. And as you mentioned, Indian Prime Minister going to Greece is also a very interesting story in and of itself. 40 years after 40 years, Indian Prime Minister will be there, and there is a lot of talk about logistics, about Indian investment in infrastructure in Greece, and Greece becoming a gateway for India towards Europe. So I think India is also making this point to perhaps countries like Turkey, that there is, that India's ties with Greece are about India's presence in the Mediterranean, India's reach in the Mediterranean, and a certain way in which India looks at the world, and that part of the world in particular. So I think it's going to be an interesting visit in some ways, because, of course, after 4 decades, if a prime minister goes there and signs a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement, and then it is meant to send a message, I think, not only to countries like Turkey, but also to various other countries in the region and beyond, that India is serious about its Mediterranean outreach.
Absolutely, like you mentioned, India's outreach or India's growing presence in the Mediterranean. Just to go back to this China question, how about India's influence in Southeast Asia? Looking at what's happening between the fresh row or the scaled up tension between China and Philippines actually asking China to slow down the aggression. Will this also be brought up or could be discussed during the Brics? Because the tension there in the Spratly Islands is on the rise, and how could China, India maneuver this?
I think it's a it's a very interesting situation there because India, for the first time, has used the 2016 award of the arbitration tribunal that went in favor of Philippines. And when the Philippines foreign minister was here during the joint statement, that was mentioned categorically by India that both sides should adhere to international law, and in particular this 2016 award was mentioned. And this is a change. This was a change in India's position. So I think India itself is now becoming more assertive when it comes to South China Sea disputes, and making it very clear that India stands on the side of those countries that believe in certain principles, because they have direct bearing on what India will be able to do and how India will pursue its interests. So I think India's role in Southeast Asia is also under scanner. We have seen, for example, with Philippines, a new vitality. We have BrahMos being sold to Philippines, and now a line of credit in defense being negotiated. So a lot of things happening there, which Chinese will not be very happy about. But I think that in some ways reflects India's desire to be around Chinese periphery in ways that China is in India's periphery, and also to ensure that there are that India retains some leverage when it sits with China and talks about global issues as well. It is not simply about India-China bilateral issues. That India as a global player is also now talking about global issues that may impinge on China in multiple ways. So that is going to be, I think, increasingly a part of India-China conversations, because the India-China relationship, or if you want to call it India-China contestation, is increasingly visible even on global platforms like SCO or even in Brics. So I think it's going to be an interesting exercise going forward. How do we recalibrate our stance in these platforms that emerged in a different era, but now have to reflect contemporary realities?
Yeah, and it'll be very interesting to see if there is a meeting, one-on-one between Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping. Before we close this episode, I would like your comment on the situation in America, which is getting very interesting by the day, looking at the legal mess that Trump is in. How is that going to, and again, it's really divided, the opinion there, in spite of whatever legal mess Trump is in, people in favor of Trump. How is it shaping and affecting the political discourse there, his courtroom appearances?
It's with Mr. Trump. It's always a theater out there, and he loves to play to the gallery. So uh, and it has just begun. I mean, if you imagine that you will have his court appearances now from October onwards, relatively consistently, and as he enters into the election cycle, in particular the cycle of where the Republican nominee is chosen, it would be very interesting, because he'll be one day in the court and the other day he'll be debating with his opponents within the Republican Party. But as we know, that the numbers today tell us that within the Republican Party he's far ahead of his opponents, and that there is no one really, who even close to giving him a serious competition. So
And why that, Harsh? Like, what do you see as the reason, his popularity
I think within the
still?
Republican Party, you still have a core of Republican voters which are more vocal, which are more assertive, which believe in what Trumpism stands for, which continue to believe every single thing he says. So whether it is about American institutions, they are willing to believe the worst in the American about in the American institutions, in the present government, in the US, in the way he has framed a very oppositional style of politics vis-a-vis not only Democrats but also those who oppose him within the Republican Party. So the challenge I think for the Republicans now is, when you are entering into the nomination phase, only the Republicans are voting. Now the Republicans, if the base that supports Trump comes out in huge numbers, makes Trump the nominee, it's not entirely evident that Mr. Trump will be able to defeat Mr. Biden, because that's something that we know had happened in the past, and Biden ended up defeating Trump in swing states. So I think the challenge here is how do Republicans look at this from a national vantage point? Are they willing to sacrifice their national presidential ambitions for the sake of an ideological battle at the core of the Republican Party? And that is a very interesting phase or interesting thing to observe in American politics at the moment. But I think this is a saga that will continue to be with us for a very, very long time. And as Mr. Trump's legal woes continue, and as his political ambitions emerge once again on the national stage, I think this is the story that we'll be returning to again and again.
And it'll be a very interesting story to watch of what's really happening. Like you pointed out, that there is an ideological battle at the core of the Republican Party, and are they willing to sacrifice their ambition at the national level for this? Thank you so much for joining us, Harsh, and for your comments on all these very important issues. We'll be looking forward to what's happening in Brics and Prime Minister's Greece visit. So thank you, all of you, for joining us on this episode.